edition of Torah Truth, part of the Sextemper Tyrannis News, but you know me, I do a lot of biblical analysis as well as news analysis. And so today I thought I would go over some news, biblically, we'll say, some studies from the Scripture that may help us in our modern times, because right now we've seen, a lot of stuff. I mean, war around the world, conflicts around the world, invading Venezuela, fights between NATO and Russia, even though they don't say it's NATO, they say it's Ukraine, Iran and them kicking up. I mean, just all over the place. Economic turmoil, tariffs, protests going on here in the United States with ICE and these Antifa groups and anti-ICE groups, and things of this nature. A lot more violence and things. And the Scripture says that because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. And of course, iniquity is from the Greek word anomios, which means a violation of law, or the breaking of the law. And if you look in Strong's Concordance, it says breaking of the Jewish law, which would be the law of Moses, which is really not Moses' law, but it's the Holy One's law. It's the commandments, the statutes and the judgments that the Holy One gave to Moses, to give to his people, as, of course, then as a covenant to keep his commandments and so on. And then in Deuteronomy, Hashem says one of the things that the Almighty told Moshe to tell the people was that you should love Yahweh with all your heart, soul, and might, and that you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. Yeshua said these are the two greatest commandments. On these two commandments hang all of the law and the prophets, the Torah and the Nevi'im. So love, right? Later on, Shaul in the New Testament, Paul, commonly known as, talks about love and how love is important. If you don't have love, you're like a clanging cymbal, he says. It's you're hollow inside. And he said 3 things abide: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these things is love. There's another scripture that says that Yahweh is love. This is something that we are seeing being destroyed in the earth. Iniquity is abounding, and the love of many is waxing cold. And so today I wanted to come on and I wanted to talk about, I did a study a long time back. I don't even know when this was written, probably in the early 90s, as I've done a lot of research, and this is one of my research papers. And I do tons of research, and as a matter of fact, here, if you can see on the screen here, these are notes and stuff that I've taken over the years. This is just a small amount. I mean, I've got whole totes full of studies and research that I have done over the years, that I've typed up, handwritten a lot of it for researching. And so today I wanted to go over just one of the studies that I've done here that I think you'll find interesting, and it's the message of Elijah. In a sense, I call it the message of Elijah. And the intention of this study is, one, to bring forth a proper understanding of Malachi chapter 4, verse 5 and 6, to establish the life setting of the days of Eliyahu the Navi, or Elijah the prophet, and also to establish the major reforms and corrections that Eliyahu fought for in his day. Also to establish and reveal the form of idolatry and apostasy from the true worship that was happening in his day. Also, to investigate specific instances where Eliyahu's career as a prophet or Navi, in order to evaluate the coming of the Elijah in the future. Also, the intention of this study is to bring a relationship between the J, E, and P forms with the separation of the United Kingdom under Solomon, which split under Rehoboam his son. Now, with that, I'm going to explain this. There are a lot of people that don't really agree with the J, E, P, and D sources, which is it's a theory basically on how the Torah and that things were compiled. Now, in my opinion, this doesn't take away from my belief and faith in the Holy One of Israel. But I want to show you this because what they show is that basically when in the J document is stands for the Yahwist documents in the earliest sources where the name of Yahweh was used. The E text are the Elohist text where the term Elohim was used. The P text are the priestly text, and then the D text is the Deuteronomic texts. So just bear with me as you watch this. You don't necessarily have to agree with those theories, but it's not going to take from the study, okay? So just bear with me, hear me out, and if you don't agree, you can agree to disagree, but still I think you'll get a lot from the message. So that's going to be part of it. And also to show that the central place of worship in Jerusalem was a stumbling block to Jeroboam, the king of Israel at the time. That he had devised a way through false worship to prevent the children of Israel from worshiping in Judah's capital, Jerusalem. Also, I want to show that he expelled the Levites from his territory and he had established his own priesthood at the time. And that these events prepared the way for Ahab and his Sidonian wife to bring in the great apostasy to the northern tribes through the worship of Baal and Adonai. So that's going to be what I'm going to discuss. As I do so, I am also going to, I'll pull scripture up on the screen so we can kind of see the scripture as we are going through this. And so I hope you enjoy this because, first of all, like I said, Eliyahu is his name in Hebrew. Eliyahu, or Elijah, basically breaks down to my strength is Yah, the short poetic form of the name Yahweh, the creator of the universe. My strength, or my mighty one. Commonly translated as God. I don't use that term because if you look it up, the term God is more in reference to deities or idols, inanimate objects. It's not really a proper term for the Holy One. So the term El has its root in the terms Yul, Y-L, and Vav El, which means strength or might, power. So El, or Eli, would be my strength, or my mighty one is Yah, Eliyahu. So that's the name, but in the book of Malachi, it talks about the end times, basically, and it talks about the coming of Elijah. So I wanted to start off with that. And if you go to Malachi, I'm going with the King James Version. Of course, I could go by others, but we'll go by this one. Malachi 4, it says, "For behold, the day comes," and as a matter of fact, I am going to use a different version because it's still a really good one, but it restores the name of the Almighty in the Old Testament. So I'm going to use that one instead. So here's what it says. It says, For behold, the day comes, burning like a furnace, when all the proud and all who work wickedness will be stubble. The day comes that will burn them up, says Yahweh of armies, Yahweh of hosts, or Yahweh Tzebaot, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But to you who fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in its wings. You will go out and leap like calves of the stall. You shall tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet in the day that I make, says Yahweh of armies, Yahweh of hosts. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all of Israel, even statutes and ordinances. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet, before the great and terrible day of Yahweh comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. And so this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about, if you look, I'm going to go back to chapter 3 real quick. And bear with me on this, because I didn't set all this up to, beforehand. So, but let's read this section. All right. It says, now listen, this is referring to Eliyahu or Elijah. But he says, behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And then here in the Hebrew, it says the Lord, which would be Adonai. In sense, if you look at this, it would be in reference possibly to, could reference the Messiah in a sense, because in this term I'd have to look at the Hebrew English. Let me take a look at that real quick. And so let's go to Malachi chapter 3, because I want to discuss that as well. It says, behold, I will send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. Now in this text, of course, it says the Lord whom you seek. Well, here, this is not referring to the Holy One, in my opinion, but what it's referring to is Mashiach, possibly. Because when he says, behold, I send my messenger, and he'll prepare the way before me, it is Eliyahu is the messenger preparing the way for Almighty Yahweh. But then he refers to Ha'adon, whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Behold, the messenger of the covenant, whom you desire is coming, says Yahweh of armies. So this is, in my opinion, referring to different things. This is possibly also referring to when it says Ha'adon, referring to Yeshua. But if you look at it, Elijah prepares the way for Almighty Yahweh, but he also prepares the way for Yeshua, who then prepares the way for Almighty Yahweh. Okay? I know it's a little complicated. But the reason I'm saying that is, let me show you here. If you look in the Hebrew text, Hineni Sholeach Malachi is saying, behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall clear the way from before me. And then, and it says, and the Ha'adon, the Lord, in Hebrew, when you refer to Adon, it's referring to a term of respect to a person. Okay, it can refer to the Holy One. Sometimes they used that term, and they use it in the Hebrew text. And in this case, it is a term that, if you look in like Smith's Bible Dictionary, Unger's Bible Dictionary, it says it's not rightfully a divine term being used of masters and slaves and so on. But it is a term of respect that you would call someone Adon. So it's not necessarily reserved only to the Holy One. And so that's why I said in this text, you could look at it almost as referring possibly to either, he's saying, I'm going to send my messenger, Eliyahu, who's going to prepare the way for before me. This is what Yahweh is declaring. And the Ha'adon, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant, whom you delight in, behold, he comes, says Yahweh of hosts. Okay, now let's go back to the text. And then it says, we'll go to the Bible Gateway. I can see that one a little better here. But it says, but who can endure the day of his coming, and who will stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi, and refine them as gold and silver. And they shall offer to Yahweh offerings in righteousness. Then the offerings of Yehuda and Jerusalem will be pleasant to Yahweh in the day, as in the days of old, as in the ancient of years. Okay? And he says, I will come near to you to judgment. I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against the perjurers, and against those who oppress the hireling of his wages, and the widows, and the fatherless, and those who despise the foreigner of justice and don't fear me, says Yahweh. For I, Yahweh, do not change, therefore you sons of Jacob are not consumed. From the days your fathers have turned away from my ordinances, and have not kept them, return to me, and I will return to you, says Yahweh of hosts. And he goes on, and he talks about these things. So we're going to stop at that point so I can go back to some of this study. But here's what I want to talk about. Elijah is the message of Yahweh. Okay, Eliyahu is what, in a sense, that's what it's looking at. You're looking at the message of Almighty Yahweh. Why do I say that? Well, let's go to Romans, for example. Romans chapter 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the good news of Messiah. Okay, it says the term Christ there. I'm going to use the term Messiah. For I am not ashamed of the message or the good news of Messiah, because it is what? The power of Yahweh for salvation, for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. So here, the term power of Yahweh is Eliyahu. Okay, I would see that as the mighty one of Yahweh, or the power of Yahweh, the strength of Yahweh, Eliyahu. For I am not ashamed of the good news of Messiah, for it is the power of Yahweh for salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So Eliyahu, what is that in a sense? That's the message of Yahweh. You see what I'm saying? Now, let's look at Proverbs chapter 10, verse 29 also. And here it says, the way of Yahweh is strength to the upright. The way of Yahweh is strength to the upright, but destruction shall be to the workers of iniquity. Okay? Destruction shall be to the workers of iniquity. What is that? Lawlessness. But the way of Yahweh is strength. Again, Yahweh is my strength, or my strength is Yahweh, Eliyahu. You see where I'm coming? Now, with that, I want to talk about Elijah the prophet. Okay, we're going to go into 1 Kings chapter 17 through 21. And I'm going to be talking about the message of Elijah, or the strength of Yahweh, Eliyahu. Okay? Now, with this, I'm going to go in and explain some things for this study so that you can have an understanding. But Baal, the term Baal, is translated in English as Lord. Okay? But it designated the chief god of the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. And the cult was preserved by the Hebrews in Palestine, in spite of the rebukes of the people, or of the prophets, despite the rebukes of the prophets. An example of that is in 1 Kings chapter 16. And here's an example of where the prophets were condemning this idolatry of worshiping the Canaanite gods. Baalim also designates some local gods, and I'll show you that as well. But here's what it says. And it came to pass, let me pull it up. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took the wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he then, it says, reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahav made a grove, and Ahav did more to provoke Yahweh Almighty of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So the worship of Baal had become very dominant in Israel at that time under Ahav, and he married Jezebel. And the Baalim is the term lords. It designates a lot of the local gods, and one example of that is in Judges, and I'll show you that. Judges chapter 2:11. Let's go there. And what does it say? And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of Yahweh and served Baalim, the lords. Okay, these deities, these Canaanite and Phoenician idols, basically. So I want to discuss that, and then also, I believe it's in verse 32. Let me look here. Verse 32 of this chapter. Is it 32 or 22? But they forsook Yahweh and worshipped Baal and Ashtaroth, and so on, okay? Went whoring after other gods, after the idols, and didn't follow the commandments of Almighty Yahweh, and so on, okay, in the book of Judges. And so we're going to talk about that, but there is Beth Ha-Baal is the house. If you translated that, it would be translated in English as the house of the Lord. So again, keep this in mind as we do the study. And so let's look at Jezebel or Baal-zebel. What is Baal-zebel? Beelzebub. It translates later too. Lord of the Flies, but also Baal-zebel is Lord the Prince. Jezebel was the wife of Ahab, and she was instrumental in supporting the worship of Baal, and or of both Baal and Asherah. And the Asherah poles were used to determine the equinoxes in those days, the solar and the lunar and solar equinoxes, for the worship of these idols in opposition to the Holy One. And so you have that. And they lived around 850 BC, and her father was Ethbaal, the Sidonian, and Et Baal would be the Lord, basically, and translated. So his name, they gave worship to these idols of the Phoenicians and Canaanites. Okay, so think about that too. And Ahab was king of northern Israel around 870 to 850 BCE, and he reigned for around 22 years. Okay, so we're going to go on though. So in 1 Kings chapter 16, we're going to go to that. And we're going to go over 1 Kings chapter 1 through 34, verse 1 through 34 of chapter 16. If you look at verse 32 in this chapter, I'm going to show you something real quick. 29, or maybe that's not the right one. Yeah, verse 32. He raised up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal. Okay. He raised up an altar right here. Raised up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal. You see that right there? In the house of Baal. He raised up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal. Baal being translated as Lord. The house of the Lord. So, again, I want you to think about that as we're doing this study. Yahweh's word came to Jehu the son of Hanani against Baasha, saying, what? Because I exalted you out of the dust and made you prince over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel to sin, to provoke me to anger with their sins, behold, I will utterly sweep away Baasha and the house and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. The dogs will eat Baasha's descendants who die in the city, and he who dies of his in the field, the birds of the sky will eat. Now, the rest of the acts of Baasha, what he did, and his might, aren't they written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Baasha slept with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah, and Elah, his son, reigned in his place. Moreover, Yahweh's word came by the prophet Jehu, which would be Yahu in Hebrew, the son of Hanani, against Baasha and against his house, both because of all the evil that he did in Yahweh's sight, to provoke him to anger with the work of his hands, in being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he struck him. In the 26th year of Asa, the king of Judah, Elah, the son of Baasha, began to reign over Israel in Tirzah for 2 years. His servant Zimri, a captain of half of his chariots, conspired against him, and now he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, who was over the household of Tirzah. And Zimri went in and struck him and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, the king of Judah, and reigned in his place. When he began to reign, as soon as he sat on his throne, he attacked all the house of Baasha. He didn't leave him a single one who urinates on the wall, pisses on the wall. So what that means is he didn't leave any males. This is a Hebrew idiom. He who pisses against the wall refers to the men. So he destroyed all of the men. There wasn't a man left, it says. There wasn't one who urinates on a wall among his relatives or his friends. Thus Zimri destroyed all the house of Baasha according to Yahweh's word, which he spoke against Baasha by Yahu the prophet, or Jehu the prophet. All the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, which they sinned, and with which they made Israel to sin, to provoke Yahweh, the mighty one of Israel, to anger, and with their vanities. Now, the rest of the acts of Elah and all that he did, aren't they written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned in the 7 days in Tirzah. Now the people were encamped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. The people who were encamped heard that Zimri had conspired and had killed also the king. Therefore all of Israel made Omri, the captain of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. Omri went up from Gibbethon, and all of Israel went with him, and they besieged Tirzah. When Zimri saw the city was taken, he went into the fortified part of the king's house and burned the king's house over him with fire, and he died. For his sins which he sinned in doing, which was evil in Yahweh's sight, and walking in the ways of Jeroboam, and within his sin did he make Israel to sin. Now the rest of the acts of Zimri, with his treason that he committed, aren't they written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? And the people of Israel were divided into two parts. Now listen, half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, who made him king, and half followed Zimri. But the people who followed Zimri prevailed against the people who followed Tibni, the son of Ginath. So Tibni died, and Omri reigned. In the 31st year of Asa, the king of Judah, Omri began to reign over Israel for 12 years, and he reigned 6 years in Tirzah. He bought the hill of Samaria and Shamir for 2 talents of silver. And he built on the hill, and he called the name of the city in which he built Samaria the name of Shamir, the owner of the hill. Omri did that which was evil in Yahweh's sight, and dealt wickedly above all who were before him. For he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, in his sins which he had made Israel to sin, to provoke Yahweh, the mighty one of Israel, to anger with their vanities. Now, the rest of the acts of Omri and what he did and his might that he showed, aren't they written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab, his son, reigned in his place. Now we're going to talk about Ahab. Now, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Ahab, the son of Omri, did that which is evil in Yahweh's sight above all that were before him, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He took his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Athbal, the king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He raised up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal at Beth Baal, or Beth Habal, which he had built in Samaria. Ahab made an Asherah and built, and Ahab did more yet to provoke Yahweh, the mighty one of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. In these days, Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abraham his firstborn, and he set up the gates with the loss of his younger son Segub, according to Yahweh's word which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. Remember when he told him that he was going to do that, he would lay the foundations with the deaths of his sons. Okay, so we're going to go, so I wanted to go there and just read that first. This is 1 through 34, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because some of the characteristics of Eliyahu, okay, we're going to talk about that. For one thing, Eliyahu, some of his characteristics was he had a strong conviction to serve Yahweh in the face of many dangers. I'm going to talk about that. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 18. So it says, after many days, Yahweh's word came to Eliyahu, or Elijah, in the 3rd year, saying, Go and show yourself to Ahab and I will send rain on the earth. Now remember, Ahab and Jezebel, they set up the idols to Baal, to the Lord, in the house of the Lord. They're worshiping these Canaanite Phoenician deities and Asherah, and they're using Asherah, the Asherah pole, to set up the to basically worship the idols according to the idolatry, using the solar and lunar equinoxes to determine the pagan feast days, which was idolatry to the Holy One. Okay, so that's what that is. So let's go to it. So he goes there to show himself to Ahab, and it says Eliyahu went to show himself to Ahab. The famine was severe in Samaria. Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now Obadiah had feared Yahweh greatly. For when Jezebel cut off Yahweh's prophets, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them 50 days in a cave and fed them with bread and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land, go to all the springs of water and to all the brooks. Perhaps we may find grass and save the horses and the mules alive, that we may not lose all of the animals." And so they divided the land between them to pass through it. And Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went the other way by himself. As Obadiah was on the way, behold, Eliyahu met him. He recognized him and fell on his face and said, "Is it you, my Adonai Eliah?" So again, here he uses the term Adon for Lord. Okay, so doesn't mean Elijah is a god, right? It's not. He's not that type of Lord. It's Adon. And so this is what he's saying. Okay, so now he answers and says, "It is I. Hineni, behold, it's me. Tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here." Okay, tell your Lord, he's talking to, tell Ahab. And he says, "How have I sinned that you would deliver your servant into the hands of Ahab to kill me? As Yahweh your mighty one lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my Lord, my Adon, has not sent to seek you. When they said, 'He is not here,' he took an oath of the kingdom and the nation that they didn't find you. Now you say, 'Go and tell your Lord, your Adon, behold, Elijah is here.' It will happen as soon as I leave you that Yahweh's Spirit will carry you, I don't know to where. And so when I come to tell Ahab he can't find you, he will kill me. But I, your servant, have feared Yahweh from my youth. Wasn't it told my Adon, my Lord, that what I did when Jezebel killed Yahweh's prophets, how I hid 100 men of Yahweh's prophets with 50 to a cave and fed them with bread and water? And now you say, 'Go and tell your Lord, behold, Eliyahu is here. He will kill me.'" So he is terrified that he will be killed. Right? Obadiah is. Eliyahu says, "As Yahweh of army of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today." So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Eliyahu. When Ahab saw Eliyahu, Ahab said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" He answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house, in that you have forsaken Yahweh's commandments, and you have followed Baal, the Baalim, the lords," right? These Canaanite idols. "Now therefore send and gather to me all of Israel to Mount Carmel, and 450 of the prophets of Baal, and 400 of the prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent all the children of Israel and gathered them, right? Okay, so we'll stop there for a second. We'll stop it here. But he sees that he calls him the troubler of Israel, and he, basically is hunting these prophets because they want to destroy the prophets of Almighty Yahweh because they serve the Lord, Baal. So now let's go to 1 Kings chapter 21. Okay, so now we're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 22 through 29. Let's go down to that. So it says, I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah, for the provocation with which you provoked me to anger, and have made Israel to sin. Yahweh also spoke of Jezebel, saying, the dogs will eat Jezebel by the rampart of Jezebel. The dogs will eat he who dies of Ahab in the city, and the birds of the sky will eat he who dies in the field. Okay, so this here is because of the persecution that Ahab and Jezebel were trying to do in destroying the prophets of Almighty Yahweh, and in forsaking the commandments of Almighty Yahweh to serve the Canaanite deities, the lords, the Baalim. Now let's go to, and we've read 1 Kings 18:1 right there, but let's also go to then the book of James, chapter 5:17. I want to show you what it says. James 5:17 says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain, and it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. Because why? He was a prophet of the Holy One. So his conviction to challenge idolatry and corruption was at great odds with them. It put him in severe danger, right? Eliyahu was not afraid of that, though, because he knew that he was serving Almighty Yahweh against these odds. So let's go to that right there. That is in 1 Kings chapter 18. And we're going to start at, so 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 19 through 22. Let's look at that. So this is when Ahab finds Eliyahu, and calls him a troubler of Israel. And that's when Eliyahu, standing up to this king, says this. He says, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house, in that you have forsaken Yahweh's commandments, and you have followed the Baalim, the lords. Right? Now, therefore, he says, send and gather to me all of Israel to Mount Carmel, and 450 of the prophets of Baalim, and 400 prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. So, it says, Ahab sent to all the children of Israel, and gathered the prophets together to Mount Carmel. Eliyahu came near to all the people and said, what? He said, how long will you waver between two sides? In the scripture, I think in King James, it says, how long will you halt between two opinions? How long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is the mighty one, follow him. But if Baal, the Lord, then follow him. It says the people did not say a word. And then Eliyahu said to the people, even I only am left as a prophet of Yahweh, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let them therefore give us 2 bulls, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire under it. And I will dress the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire under it. You call on the name of your God, and I will call on Yahweh's name. The mighty one, or the God who answers by fire, let him be the mighty one, right? The mighty one who answers, let him be the mighty one. Let him be Elohim, in the Hebrew. All of the people answered, what you say is good. Okay, so here you can see that he challenged these people regardless of what the consequences could be. He could have been arrested and murdered by Ahab and them. So he, did this at great risk to himself, and his conviction to speak against these evil doers regardless of rank or social position. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 16 through 18, we looked at that where, when Ahab came to him and said, is that you troubler of Israel? And Eliyahu said, I'm not the troubler of Israel, you are. You're the one who has broken the commandments of Almighty Yahweh. You're the one who's serving the lords, these idols of the Phoenicians and Canaanites and Asherah. You're the troubler of Israel. You are causing the children of Israel to go astray. Right? Let's also look at 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 22 through 29. So here is what Eliyahu says. He says, I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, for the provocation which you have provoked me to anger, and have made Israel to sin. He also said that, and we read this part, that he's going to make the dogs eat Jezebel, and the dogs will eat him who dies of Ahab in the city, and the birds of the sky will eat he who dies in the field. So this is what Elijah says to these people, to these kings, these political figures who have power to put him to death. So he said this at great odds. His conviction, not only to speak out against this corruption, but also his ability to enforce discipline and punishment at Yahweh's word. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 9. When Jehu came to Jezebel, let me go to that so you can see it. When Jehu had come to Jezebel, Jezebel heard of it. She's talking about... So this was when Elisha the prophet had called one of the sons of the prophets and said to him, put your belt on your waist, take this vial of oil in your hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. And when you go there, find Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat of Nimshi, and go in and make him rise up from among his brothers and take him to an inner room, and then take the vial of oil and pour it on his head and say, Yahweh says, I've anointed you king over Israel. Open the door and flee and don't wait, right? So the young men, the young prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead, and when they came, behold, the captains of the army were sitting there, and he says, I have a message for you, captain. Jehu said, to which one of us? And he said, to you, O captain. He arose, he went into the house, he poured the oil on his head, said to him, Yahweh, the mighty one of Israel, said, I have anointed you king over the people of Yahweh, even over Israel. This is Jehu, right? You must strike your master Ahab's house, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets and the blood of all the servants of Yahweh at the hand of Jezebel. For the whole house of Ahab will perish, and I will cut him off from Ahab, everyone who urinates against a wall, the men, both him who is shut up and him who is left at large in Israel. I will make Ahab's house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah. The dogs will eat Jezebel on the plot of ground of Jezebel, and there shall be no one to bury her. And he opened the door and fled. So then Jehu came out to his servants, the servants of his Lord, and said to one of him, in this Lord, small L, his master, and said, is all well? Why does this madman come to you? And he said to him, you know the man, how he talks. He said, that is a lie. Tell us how. And he said, he said to me, Yahweh says, I have anointed you king over Israel. Then they hurried, and each man took his cloak and put it under him on the top of the stairs, and they blew the trumpet, saying, Jehu is king. So Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. Now Joram was defending Ramoth Gilead, and he and all of Israel, because of Hazael, the king of Syria. But the king Joram had returned to be healed in Jezebel of the wounds which the Syrians had given him when he fought with Hazael, king of Syria. And so Jehu said, if this is your thinking, then let no one escape and go out of the city to go tell it to Jezreel. So Jehu rode in a chariot and went to Jezreel, for Joram lay there, and as Ahaziah, the king of Judah, had come down to see Joram. Now the watchman was standing on the tower in Jezreel, and he spied the city of Jehu as he came, and said, I see a company. Joram said, take a horseman and send to meet him, and let him say, is it peace? So one went on horseback to meet him and said, the king says, is it peace? Jehu said, what do you have to do with peace? Fall in behind me. The watchman said, the messenger came to me, but he isn't coming back. Then he sent out a second on horseback, who came to him and said, the king says, is it peace? Jehu answered, what do you have to do with peace? Fall in behind me. The watchman said, he came to them, but isn't coming back. The driving is like the driving of Jehu the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously. Joram said, get ready. They got his chariot ready. Then Joram the king of Israel and Ahaziah the king of Judah went out, each with his chariot, and they went out to meet Jehu and found him on Naboth the Jezreelite's land. When Joram saw Jehu, he said, is it peace, Jehu? He answered, what peace? So long as the prostitution of your mother Jezebel and her witchcraft abounds. Joram turned his hands and fled, and said to Ahaziah, this is treason, Ahaziah. Jehu then drew his bow and with his full strength and struck Joram between the arms, and the arrow went out at his heart, and he sunk down in his chariot. Then Jehu said to Bidkar, his captain, pick him up and throw him in the plot of the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. For remember how when you and I rode together after Ahab his father, Yahweh laid this burden on him. Surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, says Yahweh, and I will repay you in this plot of ground, says Yahweh. Now therefore take and cast him into the plot of the ground according to Yahweh's word. But when Ahaziah the king of Judah saw this, he fled by the way of the garden house. Jehu followed after him and said, strike him also in his chariot. They struck him at the ascent of Gur, which is by Eblim. He fled to Megiddo and died there. His servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in his tomb with his father's city, David, in his father and David's city. In the 11th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, Ahaziah began to reign over Judah. Then Jehu came to Jezreel. Jezebel heard of it and painted her eyes. Now listen, so Jehu now is king, right, being anointed. And so she paints her eyes and adorns her head, it says, and looked out the window. And as Jehu had entered the gate, she said, do you come in peace, Zimri, you murderer of your master? He lifted up his face to the window and said, who is on my side? Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs looked at him. He said, throw her down. So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses. And then he trampled underfoot when he came in, and he ate and drank. And then he said, see now to this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. But they went to bury her, but they found no more of her than the skull, the feet, and the palms of her hands. Therefore they came back in and told him. He said, this is Yahweh's word, which he spoke by his servant Eliyahu the Tishbite, saying, the dogs will eat the flesh of Jezebel on the plot of Jezreel, and the body of Jezebel will be as dung on the surface of the field on Jezreel's land, so that they won't say, this is Jezebel. Okay? So, you can see, like I said, the conviction not only to speak out against corruption, but also his ability to enforce discipline and the punishment of Yahweh's word. Eliyahu predicted this and said, this is the prophecy, that Ahab and Jezebel would die, and they would be, and she would be eaten by the dogs and things. Also, his ability to remember at the same time, being both a prophet by the power and protection of Yahweh and human with frailties and weaknesses. Some of the characteristics of his time, if you think about it, I want to show you, in my opinion, between his time and you could think about the book of Revelation in the end times. One, there was a drought in his time, 3.5 years, because of the wickedness that was in the land. There were great miracles performed, right? There was a resurrection. Also, great wickedness abounded in politics and in the general population. And there was also a famine. So you can see some of those things similar to the scripture. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 31, King Ahab, remember, had married Jezebel, and she was the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Phoenicians, or the Sidonians. A major campaign for Baal worship then ensued during his reign. And remember, they said they built worship to Baal in Beth HaBaal, or the house of the Lord. Beth HaBaal was set up, and an altar by which they would imply a priesthood set up in the altar in the honor of Baal. If you set up an altar in a house, you've got priests. These were the priests of Baal. And let's go to 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 9. It says, "Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to sustain you." This was basically showing that this is where Jezebel and her father lived at. They lived in this area. And then in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 4, Jezebel set out to obviously destroy the worship of Yahweh by attempting to kill all the prophets of Yahweh, and in order to promote the worship of Baal, right? The Lord, Baalim, the Canaanite deities, the Phoenician, Sidonian deities at that time. Because she had killed some of the prophets of Yahweh. And so here's what it says. Remember in verse 7 it says, "You must strike your master Ahab's house, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of Yahweh at the hand of Jezebel." And so during this time, there was also a major campaign to find Eliyahu, the troubler of Israel, as we saw, by Ahab and Jezebel, for the fact that he had declared a drought in the land. And that was in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 10 and verse 17, where he declared this. So think about it. You know, this message I say in my notes here, what I want you to think about is, how long will you continue to be swayed by separate doctrines? How long will you be caught between two opinions? Either Yahweh is the mighty one or Baal is, but you cannot serve both. You know? So Baal, again, is the term Lord, as it would be translated. So the prophets Jeremiah and Hosea came forth with this message against Baal worship as well. And I'm going to show you a couple of these texts. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 23, for example. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 26 and 27. I'm going to start at verse 25. It says, "I have heard what the prophets have said, who prophesy lies in my name, saying," let me go to that so you can see it. Okay. "I have heard what the prophets have said, who prophesy lies in my name, saying, I had a dream, I had a dream. How long will this be in the heart of the prophets who prophesy lies, even the prophets of the deceit of their own heart? They intend to cause my people to forget my name by their dreams, which they tell every man his neighbor, just as their fathers forgot my name because of Baal," or forgot my name for Baal, meaning they substituted Yahweh's name. They stood aside. Instead of worshiping Almighty Yahweh, they worshipped Baal, the Lord. Think about that. I'm showing a message here. Eliyahu the prophet, coming into the days of wickedness, when the politician, the kings of that time, and Jezebel and them decided to turn away from the covenant of Yahweh and the commandments and worship the Baalim. There was famine in the land. There was great evil in the land. And as a result, then there was a drought because Eliyahu the prophet prophesied against them. There was persecution of the prophets of Almighty Yahweh at that time. Right? So that's one place. And then also Hosea chapter 2, 16 and 17. Let's look at that one. So here he says that the prophets are telling every man their dreams, telling them, I had a dream, and they're causing the people to forget the name of Almighty Yahweh and the worship of Almighty Yahweh and follow the Canaanite and Phoenician deities of Baal, the Lord. Now, let's go to Hosea. It says, it will be in that day, says Yahweh, that you will call me my husband, Ishi, and no longer call me Baali, my Lord, or my master. Why? For I will take away the names of the Baalim out of her mouth, and they will no longer be mentioned by name. Okay. Now, you think about in the days of Elijah, the worship of Baal, and Hashem was angry about the mixing of the worship of Baal with Yahweh. And Eliyahu said, how long will you be caught between two opinions? Either Yahweh has to be the mighty one or Baal. There's even been archaeological finds where they have found altars that have an altar dedicated in a sense to the Holy One, Almighty Yahweh, and Baal worship mixed. Now this was forbidden by the Holy One. And Jezebel comes from a couple words. Some translate it uninhabited, but it's from number 336 and 2083 and 2073, to dwell, to not dwell, meaning to be uninhabited in a sense. So what I want to look at, I know this is kind of tedious, but I want to look at the Sitzim Liban. The Sitzim Liban means the life setting of that time. So King Ahab had married Jezebel, as we were looking at. She was the daughter of Ethbaal, who was a Canaanite, a Sidonian, around the 871 BC, sometime around there. Right? Jezebel had influenced Ahab to establish the worship of Baal on a grand scale in the northern kingdom. And the expulsion of the Levites from the northern kingdom had helped to weaken the worship of Yahweh in the land. In 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 31. Let's go there. He made houses of the high places and made priests from among all the people that were not of the sons of Levi. Right? So he basically threw out the Levites because he did not want people going back to worship Almighty Yahweh. Right? So if you look at it, and there's a lot to this part, but here's what we'll do. We'll look at it real quick. Rehoboam sent to Shechem, for all of Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was yet in Egypt, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon, and Jeroboam lived in Egypt. And they sent and called him. Jeroboam and all of the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, your father made our yoke difficult. Now therefore, make the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, which you put on us, lighter, and we will serve you. And then he said, depart for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people departed. King Rehoboam then took counsel with the older men who had stood before Solomon his father, while he yet lived, saying, What counsel do you give me to answer these people? They replied, If you will be a servant to this people today, and you will serve them and answer them with good words, then they will be your servants forever. Okay, so they gave him some decent counsel. But he abandoned the counsel of the old men which they had given him, and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. And he said to them, What counsel do you give, that we may answer these people who have spoken to me, saying, Make the yoke of your father you put on us lighter? The young men who had grown up with him said to him, Tell these people who spoke to you, saying, Now listen to this, your father made our yoke heavy, but make it lighter to us. Tell them, My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Now, my father burdened you with a heavy yoke, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastened you with whips, but I will chasten you with scorpions. So, this text, some people say this interprets, I haven't looked at it in a long time with the Hebrew, but he's saying my little finger is thicker than my father's whole waist. You think about that. So he's saying, you think my father's yoke was heavy, you wait till I throw it on you. Some people have said it doesn't say waist, but it refers to his father's penis, basically. Saying, if you think my father screwed you, my little finger is thicker than his whole waist, you know. He says, if my father chastised you with whips, but I'm going to chastise you with scorpions. And this was the reason for the separation of the kingdom. So Jeroboam and all of his people came to Rehoboam the third day and asked the king, saying, Come to me again the third day. The king answered the people roughly and abandoned the counsel of the old men which they had given him. He spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastened you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. So the king didn't listen to the people, for it was a thing brought about from Yahweh, that he might establish his word, which Yahweh spoke to Ahijah the Shilonite, to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king didn't listen to them, the people answered the king and said, What portion have we in David? We don't have an inheritance in the son of Yishai, or Jesse. To your tents, Israel. Now see to your own house, David. So Israel departed to their tents. But as for the children of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was over the men subject to forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. King Rehoboam hurried to get himself up to the chariots to flee Jerusalem. So Israel rebelled against David's house to this day. When all Israel heard Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the congregation and made him king over Israel. There no one was who had followed David's house except for the tribe of Judah only. When Rehoboam had come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, and 180,000 chosen men who were warriors to fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom against Rehoboam the son of Solomon. But the word of Yahweh came to Shemaiah the man of Yahweh, saying, Speak to Rehoboam the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and the rest of the people, saying, Yahweh says, You shall not go up to or fight against your brothers, the children of Israel. Every one return to his house, for this thing is from me. So they listened to Yahweh's word, and returned and went their way according to Yahweh's word. But Jeroboam then sent Shechem into the hill country of Ephraim, and lived in it. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And I believe Penuel means the face of El, or the face of the Almighty. Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom will return to David's house. Now think about this. This is what Jeroboam says. If this people goes off to offer sacrifices in Yahweh's house in Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to their Adon, even to Rehoboam, the king of Judah. And they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, the king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said to them, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Look and behold your gods, Israel. which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So what did he do? He reverted back to the worship of the golden calves. And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. And this thing became a sin, for all the people went even as far as Dan to worship before the one there. And it's funny because it's Dan and Bethel. If you take Dan and Bethel and put it together, what is that? House, or the judgment of the house of God. Judgment begins in the house of God. But it's interesting that that's the way that is. But so it says he made the houses of high places, the groves, the Bahamot, and he made priests from among all of the people who were not of the sons of Levi. And also Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that is in Judah. And he went up to the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priest of the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart. And he ordained a feast for the children of Israel and went up to the altar. And it's interesting because that falls around the time of Thanksgiving. Interestingly. So he diverted from the worship of Almighty Yahweh and his official feasts, and instead he devised his own altars, his own house in Bethel and one in Dan, the golden calves, and said, these are your mighty ones that have brought you up out of Egypt, not Almighty Yahweh, and not in Jerusalem. Okay? So that's basically what had happened. And so the division of the kingdom under Rehoboam opened the door for this apostasy in northern Israel, the 10 northern tribes, due to the fact that that Jeroboam attempted to solidify his portion of the empire by preventing the northern Israelite inhabitants from worshiping in Jerusalem. Jeroboam set up the gods in Dan and Bethel to be the central places of worship in northern Israel. Think about that. So, let's go to Hosea chapter 2, 16, 17. Remember, we read it. Ishi and Baali both can mean husband, but different connotations. Ishi literally means my man or my husband. It implies a relationship based on love. But Baali literally means my Lord, and can also refer to a relationship based on fear of a superior, and that's what Rashi says. You can also look at John chapter 15:15. Let's look at John 15:15 and see what Yeshua says. It says, Yeshua was talking. Let's look at it, full chapter 15. But in verse 12, Yeshua was talking to his disciples. He says, he was talking about he's being the true vine and his father is the farmer and so on, right? And he says in verse 12, this is my commandment, that you love one another, even as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. Now listen to what he says. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his Adon or his Baal, his Lord, does. But I have called you friends, for everything that I heard from my Father I have made known to you. Now, my point is with that, he's telling them, I'm not your Lord. For a Lord, a servant does not know what his Lord does. He said, but I'm your friend, because I have told you everything. Right? I wanted you to catch that. So Adonav or Adonai can mean Lord, and this complements Hosea's teaching that we have a relationship that permits us to be closer to Almighty Yahweh because he shares his plan with his chosen people. Right? Yeshua told them, you can call me, you are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant doesn't know what his Lord does. But I call you friends, for everything that I've heard from my Father I've made known to you. It's interesting, right? And I've talked about this before, but I want to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Also, this kind of explains it as well. Look at this. So 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 10 through 12. It says, again, well, I'll go back a little bit. And Shaul was talking. He says, we speak wisdom, however. Let me put that on the screen. We speak wisdom, however, among those who are full grown, yet a wisdom not of this world, nor of the rulers of this world who are come to nothing, but we speak Yahweh's wisdom in a mystery, the wisdom that has been hidden, which Yahweh foreordained before the world for our glory, which none of the rulers knew of this world has known. For if they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory, the ruler of glory. But as it is written, now listen to this, things which the eye hasn't seen and the ear hasn't heard, which didn't enter into the heart of man, these Yahweh has prepared for those who love him. But to us, Yahweh has revealed them through the Spirit. So again, eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, neither has entered in the heart of man the things that Yahweh has prepared for those who love him. But he has revealed it to us by his Spirit, it says. So he's saying that these people, they couldn't see it. None of the rulers of the world could see it because they're not servants. They are slaves to Satan, and therefore they are not children of the Almighty in a sense. Remember, Yeshua said, you are of your father, the devil. But because they are not doing the will of the Almighty, so they cannot see these things, but we can see them through the Spirit of the Almighty. And so Yeshua says that we are not his servants, we are his friends if we do what he asks us to do. And so what happened in this, he threw out the Levites and would not allow them to officiate and set up his own priests. The Levites didn't have any inheritance in the land of Canaan. Remember, for Yahweh was their portion. That's in Numbers, I think it's in Numbers chapter 18, verse 20, and also in Deuteronomy chapter 10. Remember, Yahweh said, you don't get an inheritance because I am your inheritance. And so he ordained that they should not have set apart for them 4 cities. He ordained that they should have set apart for them 4 cities out of every tribe, along with necessary pastures for their cattle. So they didn't really have their own portion, but it was donated out of the other tribes, 4 cities that they would have as their portion, and that's in Numbers chapter 35, 1 through 8. And so the revolt of the 10 tribes and the policy pursued by Jeroboam led to a great change in the position of the Levites, and they were witnesses of an appointed order and a central worship. But Jeroboam wished to make the priests loyal instruments of the king and to establish a provincial and divided worship from Judah and from Jerusalem's temple, because he did not want them unifying and going back to the king and the northern in that area down to Jerusalem. So the natural result was that the Levites left those cities assigned to them in the territories of Israel, the northern tribes, and they gathered around the metropolis of Yehuda, and this is in Judah. And 2 Chronicles 11 talks about this. And so Judah at that time was loyal to the worship of Yahweh, and the Levites were a dominant force in Judah. And so Jeroboam set up priests of his own choosing who were not Levites. And like I said, we read that in a couple places, but this is also found in 2 Chronicles 11:15, Hosea 5:8, and 6:8 through 10, and 2 Chronicles 13:1 through 11. I'm going to go into that real quick. So let's look at that. because I think this is very important for people to understand. Let's go to Hosea chapter 5 first. So Hosea says this, chapter 5, verse 8. He says, blow the cornet in Gibeah and the trumpet in Ramah. Sound the alarm in Beth Aven. Behind you, Benjamin. Let me see if that's right. Right? Beth Aven. Beth Aven. What is Aven in Hebrew? It means sin. House of sin. And then I want to go to chapter 6. I'm sorry. Chapter 6, verse 8 through 10. He says, Gilead is a city of those who work iniquity and is stained with blood. As gangs of robbers wait to ambush a man, so the company of priests murder on the path toward Shechem, committing shameful crimes. In the house of Israel I have seen a horrible thing. There is prostitution in Ephraim, and Israel is defiled. The priests are murdering on the way to Shechem. Remember, the priests of Ahab and Jezebel, the priest of Baal, murderers. Also, 2 Chronicles, let's go to 2 Chronicles 11. I'm going to show you this. And it says, he himself appointed priest for the high places. This is talking about Jeroboam. He himself appointed priest for the high places, for the male goat and the calf idols which he had made. And after them, out of all the tribes of Israel, those who had set their hearts to seek Yahweh, the Mighty One of Israel, came to Jerusalem to sacrifice to Yahweh, the Mighty One and the Father. So they strengthened the kingdom of Judah and made Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, strong for 3 years, for they walked 3 years in the way of David and Solomon. Right? The priests and the Levites, that's in verse 13. The priests and the Levites who were in all Israel stood with him out of their territory. For the Levites left their pasture lands and their possessions and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had cast them off, that they should not execute the priest's office to Yahweh. So he expelled them. He set up idolatry. Right? And then in 2 Chronicles 13, I want to show you that as well. In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijah began to reign over Judah. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. There was war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Abijah joined battle with an army of valiant men of war, even 400,000 chosen men, and Jeroboam set battle in array against him with 800,000 chosen men who were mighty men of valor. Abijah stood up on Mount Zemaraim, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, and he said, Hear me, O Jeroboam, and all of Israel. Ought you not to know that Yahweh, the Mighty One of Israel, gave the kingdom over Israel to David forever, even to him and to his sons by a covenant of salt? Yet Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the servant of Solomon, the son of David, rose up and rebelled against his Lord. Worthless men were gathered to him, wicked fellows, and who strengthened themselves against Rehoboam the son of Solomon, when Rehoboam was young and tender-hearted and could not withstand them. Now you intend to withstand the kingdom of Yahweh in the hand of the sons of David. You are a great multitude, and the golden calves which Jeroboam made you for gods are with you. Haven't you driven out the priests of Yahweh, the sons of Aaron, and the Levites, and made priests for yourselves according to the ways of the people of other lands? Whoever comes to consecrate himself with a young bull and 7 rams may be a priest of those who are no gods. He says, But as for us, Yahweh is our mighty one. Right? Eliyahu. My mighty one is Yahweh. And we have not forsaken him. We have priests serving Yahweh, the sons of Aaron, and the Levites in their work. They burn to Yahweh every morning and every evening the tamid, right? Burnt offerings and sweet incense. They also set the showbread in order on the pure table and care for the gold lamp stand with the lamps to burn every evening, for we keep the instruction of Yahweh our mighty one. But you have forsaken him. Behold, Yahweh is with us at our hand, and our priests and his priests and the trumpets of alarm to sound an alarm against you. Children of Israel, don't fight against Yahweh, the mighty one of your fathers, for you will not prosper. And Jeroboam didn't listen. So again, Jeroboam had forsaken the Almighty, turned to the idols, separated himself from the temple, and then you had, as a result, Ahab and Jezebel and all them pushing the worship of Baal. Right? So this is what I want you to see. So Israel in the time of Elijah. Let's look a little bit at that. I want to go over some of that. Militarily or politically speaking, Assyria under Nasser-Paul II from 884 to 859 and his son Shalmaneser III from 859 to 824 became, through its annual military campaigns, the leading threat to the kingdoms west of the Euphrates. Assyria, right? Assyria's might was based upon its highly effective military force, which featured a power core of war chariots and advanced siege techniques. Assyria's pillaging expeditions were intended to bring home spoils from wealthy states of Syria, gold, North Syria, gold, silver, luxury items, etc., to build the capital of Assyria called Kala, near Nimrod. Shalmaneser III continued the Assyrian expansion westwards, but the situation was now changed, and his powerful military machine was faced by two alliances, one of the North Syrian and South Anatolian states near Asia Minor, the second of the 12 kings of Hatti, or Syria, and the seacoast, the Kirk monolith, a steel monument from the 6th year of Shalmaneser's reign. The second alliance was also headed by Damascus and Hamath, followed immediately by Ahab the Israelite. Other minor members were the cities of Phoenicia, the Arabs, and a token auxiliary force from Egypt. The military force, the chariot force of Israel, exceeded the rest of its allied forces. So I'm just trying to give you an idea. So the close economic and military ties between Israel and the Syro-Phoenician states, especially Tyre or Tzor, led to an increased cultural and religious influence from these areas upon Israel. Okay, the trade. Remember when the Holy One told the children of Israel, when they go into this land, do not learn the ways of these nations, don't worship them, don't try to ask them how they worship their idols. But this influence started to influence. So these influences were augmented by the marriage of Ahab and Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Tyre, as we read. And these influences were in the art motifs that can be seen in Sumerian ivories, and in the introduction of the cult of Melkart and the Tyrian Baal, or Lord, into the royal court. And there was a temple to Baal where the Tyrian priests officiated, erected in Samaria, as we read in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 32. There was a rift between the higher classes and state officials and the lower classes. Conservative royal populations, for an example, in 1 Kings 21, the story of Naboth of Yezreel. In this instance, the king's actions were condemned by Eliyahu in chapter 21, verse 7, as we read. So I'm just kind of giving you, I want you to think about some of these things. So biblical scholars have also shown that the Old Testament, which is comprised essentially of four major narratives, the J source, E, the EP, and the P documents, woven into one, which is the major narrative or the Deuteronomic Code. The J documents are so named because in them the Almighty is always referred to as Yahweh. They are the oldest, written around about the 9th century BCE in the southern kingdom of Judah. Now think about this. The E documents, so called because in them the Almighty is referred to as Elohim, were written about 100 years after the J documents in the 8th century in the northern kingdoms. Why? Because my opinion is the J documents referred to the worship of Yahweh, whereas the E documents had forsaken Yahweh and made the golden calves. These be the Elohim that brought you out of Egypt. And they were written a little later, redacted, for the northern tribes who had forsaken Yahweh, in my opinion. So the fusion of the 5 books of Moshe, called the Torah and the Pentateuch and the Chumash, they were also then correlated. It doesn't mean that these were false documents, people, and that's what I want you to understand. But Jeroboam began his reign by deepening the rift between the two countries, and he added religious ferment to political dissension by building a temple in Bethel to rival the one in Jerusalem, around the time that the J documents were collated or written in Judah to establish true worship and to maintain it against heresy. And this was to distinguish the temple in Jerusalem as the official place of worship by canonizing the J documents, which up to that time were probably passed down orally or in fragmented documents, in my opinion. And what were they doing? It restored Yahweh's name, or it always had Yahweh's name in it. Whereas the E documents had the Elohist text, had exclusively pretty much the name Elohim primarily, and then later as they were collated, the stories come together. And so you see instances of this in the Torah where you have two documents, some saying Yahweh, some saying Elohim, and so on. Now, a lot of people don't agree with this, but I think that this is how it was, and I don't believe that it contradicts that the Torah was inspired by the Holy One through men. One instance of Eliyahu's conviction to do Yahweh's will, even in the face of great danger, was in 1 Kings 18 through 1 through 17. And I read it, but I want to talk about that. Eliyahu had already proclaimed that there was going to be a drought by the word of Yahweh, and then it happened, right? Due to this drought, which lasted about 3.5 years, a famine resulted in Samaria, which was the capital of Ephraim. Ahab, the king of Israel, was then concerned that his livestock and his cavalry horses might die because of the lack of water, or that they would have to put some of them to death. This obviously would anger the king and cause him to want to find Eliyahu, who obviously had caused all this trouble. But Eliyahu didn't allow for the possibility of and the danger to himself to deter him from what Yahweh had commanded him to do. All the same, there were also times when Eliyahu realized his frailties and his weaknesses. And one example of that was in the incident shortly after the execution of the priests of Baal, when Jezebel was informed by Ahab of what Eliyahu had done. Jezebel made a vow to her gods that she was going to do the same, that she was going to execute Eliyahu with the sword, right? Because remember when they had fire come down out of heaven and so on, and then they killed the priests of Baal. So Jezebel then made a vow to her gods that she was going to do the same by executing Eliyahu with the sword. And at this point, Eliyahu fled for his life, and he came to a point in his ministry and his office where he felt useless against the powers of evil, and that he would rather die than to feel this way. He felt he had suffered enough and wasn't any more worthy than his forebearers. Why should he live any longer, right? And that was according to a rabbi. I think it was Rabbi Radak. So, there comes sometimes in our life as well, a time where we might feel like we're somehow useless in the plan of Almighty Yahweh as well, or that we've suffered enough, and that the people we're trying to convert or talk to aren't really worth the trouble. But you got to remember, Shaul, for example, was a Pharisee, and when Yahweh called on him, he said he had testified that he must suffer for the name, for the sake of Almighty Yahweh's name. And Yahshua also warned us that we would have great tribulation in the world, that we should be of great courage. Right? So, if you notice in 1 Kings chapter 19:11, there were similarities between Elijah and Moses. And what I mean by that is in Exodus chapter 19, 1 through 23, Moses was called up to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah in order to present it to the children of Israel, where Eliyahu is also called to stand on the Mount Sinai in order to receive instruction to give it to the children of Israel. Also in Exodus chapter 19, 16 through 20, there are similarities between Moses on the mountain and Eliyahu. In both cases, signs and wonders got their attention when Yahweh spoke. And then if you look in Exodus chapter 33, verse 21, it compares to 1 Kings 19:11, where they both are to stand in front of Yahweh. And in Exodus chapter 33:22, Yahweh covers Moshe's face with his hand. In 1 Kings 19:13, Eliyahu covers his face with his talit. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 4, 10 through 15, just as Moshe saw no form when Yahweh spoke to the children of Israel, also Eliyahu saw no form in 1 Kings 19:11 when Yahweh passed by him, but he only heard his voice. Right? So, I thought that was pretty interesting. But Eliyahu, basically, his office was to destroy Baal worship. So the message of Eliyahu continues in the mouths of his prophets, and even in the prophets beforehand. Examples of this can be discussed. But, like I said, you can look at some of the characteristics. A drought for 3.5 years, great miracles performed, a resurrection, great wickedness abounding both in politics and religion as well as the common people, famine, right? The word of Yahweh is not there. Look in the book of Amos, and let me go back to this. The book of Amos was around, at this time, Amos was living around 786 to 746. He talks about the sin of Samaria. Remember, the sin of Samaria, where Ahab and them put up the Bamot in the high places. Let's look at Amos chapter 8, verse 11 through 14. Cut. Okay, so it says this. It says, Behold, the days come, says Almighty Yahweh, that I will send a famine in the land, not for a famine of bread, nor a thirst of water, but hearing of Yahweh's words. They will wander from sea to sea, and from north even to the east. And they will run back and forth to seek Yahweh's word, but they will not find it. In that day the beautiful virgins and the young men will faint for thirst. Those who swear by the sin of Samaria, and say, As your god Dan lives, and as the way of Beersheba lives, they will fall and never rise again. And that's what, again, in the days of Eliyahu and them, great wickedness and apostasy. So my thing is, this study is basically saying the message of Eliyahu in those days, would come to turn the hearts of the children to the fathers, and the hearts of the fathers to the children, lest I smite the earth with a curse. I thought it was a good spiritual lesson to look at that in light of what exactly was happening during that time. The people were turned into idolatry, worship of Asherah, setting the feast days according to the lunar and solar equinox, worshiping the Baalim, the lords of the Canaanites, and the Phoenicians, Sidonians. And so it is a spiritual lesson for our day as well, because Hashem is going to send Elijah the prophet. So what's going to be his message again in these last days is, how long will you halt between two opinions? If Yahweh is your mighty one, serve him. But if not, if Baal is your Lord, if Baal is your mighty one, then serve him. So that's the message. I hope you like the study. And with that, I'm going to sign off.